Hi, welcome. Today I'm making this dove. It's a cute little silhouette in white and black with lots of mark making and colors in the background. And I start with a collage and work all the way through to the very end. So join me. I'm glad you're here. So my collage is assembled. The size is about 4 by 4 inches, about 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters. And what I've decided to do today is I've picked a golden yellow thread and I'm going to baste with 2 strands of this floss, and I'm going to baste all the pieces. Normally what I do is I choose a floss color that matches and I keep switching and I go around and baste so it doesn't distract me when I'm working. But today I've decided that this is a very colorful piece and I'm going to be doing all sorts of stitching all over it. And so I'm going to start from the very beginning with a boulder mark and just kind of delicately moving around, because all these pieces, you know, I don't pin anything down. I just move around and I do my best. I really like to work this way. I'm being fairly slow and delicate as I do this to try not to disturb too much. This little tiny piece here is so thin and small. Just going to slowly move around. And my goal here is just to tack down all the pieces as I move around so that they're going to stay in place. And I'm using these 2 strands of floss because I want to see how I feel about having these marks in place, and it might be a case where they can add to the piece. If not, later I will just remove them. Now my collage pieces are basted in place onto the felt. I'm working on acrylic felt today. And I think what I want to do with this piece is have a hollow silhouette of a bird. And so I have lots of templates that I've made myself over the years, and I save them in a file, in a binder. And so here's an example of one. This one is on tracing paper, where I take drawings or paintings that I've made, and I trace. So I can have copies. I trace them. Sometimes I have them on cardstock. Sometimes I have them on tissue paper. Depends what I've done in that situation. So here's an example of one, and if I put it on the collage, you can see I've even drawn on, I think originally on this side in pencil, some of the details for whatever it was I was working on last time. And so if I take this bird, this is what I'm thinking of, is a bird that doesn't quite fit. You're really just getting the head of the bird. It's going to be a hollow silhouette. So when I look at that, I like that. So really now it's just sort of picking from the shapes that I have, the angles, that kind of thing. Here's another one. This one's on paper where I've scanned and printed. And I've just written on here the size that I have printed this one, because sometimes I print something in more than one size, so I have them as templates. So, I like that. So this is my idea for this collage. So what I will do is I will take, this is a fabric marking pen, and this one with the purple end disappears in the air through time. So it's a temporary pen. So really it's just a matter of placing it where I want and then tracing the bird. It's not going to show up really, really well on this sort of hot pink color. And this is just a guideline for me. I could always draw it on freehand if I wanted to, or even just stitch freehand. But this is a very helpful way, I find, of thinking about it. So if you can see, there I've got my silhouette of a bird. That's going to disappear over time. So while it's there, what I'm going to do is stitch around so that that's where I'm starting from, so I know from the very beginning what part's the inside of the bird and what part's the outside of the bird. I'm using black and I have 2 strands of embroidery floss, and I'm just going to go around and stitch this silhouette. I'm going to space out my stitches. And if I want the line to be more solid afterwards, I can always come back and make it solid. So for now, I'm just going to do this in and out stitch. So here's my bird shape, and it's not perfect, but it's a start. It lets me know where I want the bird to be as I begin to add stitches. And this is going to be sort of a hollow bird. I'm not going to try to cover up what's inside. I'm just going to stitch differently on the inside and the outside and add some details to the bird. So this is a nice start. So I've pulled some embroidery floss colors that I'm going to work with. I already had started with this yellow, which is not an exact match for this yellow, but this yellow is so sort of acidy and bright that I don't want to match it exactly. So I've chosen this color, which is fairly complementary to this orange. And these 2 oranges are a little bit different. So I pulled in a topaz that again is not exactly the same, but I thought would be a good complement. And then for the dark turquoise, I've chosen this color. And for the light turquoise, I've chosen this color. And for the green, I've chosen this color. For this pink, I've chosen this color. And then I've brought in 2 other colors that I may or may not use that I thought may be nice complements for these colors, which is this fuchsia color. Yes, it's called fuchsia, and it's got more purple in it than this color. I may or may not use that. And then the other one is this golden brown, which is a close match to the color that's here and here. So I have those out to see if I want to grab them. If I have some alternate colors in front of me, that's nice. Sometimes I will pull a whole different color once I get into it and I think about a color that I want, a value that I want. But for a start, I've got these colors that I think are a fairly good match. And then of course I have black. So I have a fairly bold line with the black. So I think I'm going to make some other bold lines, and I'm going to start with this dark turquoise. I'm thinking about a couple of things as I'm stitching. One of them is the line, the kind of line that I want to make with this turquoise color, because it's very bold, very bright. It's going to be seen. So I'm looking at this and thinking I want to move this color up into this area for balance, because it's such a bold color over here. So I'm bringing what I have left on my needle up to the top here. The other thing I'm thinking about is this bird silhouette that I've made, and I kind of have a couple of options. I can fill in stitching on the bird with black, and that will make the bird more solid, and it will contrast quite a bit with the stitching that's around the bird. Or I could do very heavy stitching in strong color contrasts outside of the bird and make the inside of the bird the lighter part of the piece. Okay, I'm just finishing this piece of floss. So I haven't decided yet what I want to do. I know I want, whatever I do, I want them to be different. So there's a nice contrast. So to help me decide where I want to go with this piece in terms of what to do with the inside of the bird and outside of the bird, I'm going to look at two other pieces that I completed. So here's one. So in this piece, I've got the larger silhouette of the bird. And what I did is I filled it in with more black and also the dark turquoise. So that was tied in with this turquoise here. And I left the underbelly of the bird less stitched. And I see what I did here was I did these green stitches, which I continued inside and outside the bird. And I like that touch. To me, this was hinting at greenery and grass. And so to me, it's in front of the bird, but it's also on the bird. And then these two tiny little crows that I put here, they're different in size, and also because they're a solid black color, they're very different than this bigger bird. So this is an interesting way to go that I could definitely do again. Here's Hazelnut. This is a larger piece. All of it may not fit in. I will put up some shots of it, some close-up shots so you can see. But in this piece, what I did is I built the collage on this text fabric. This is in my Spoonflower shop. It's S for stitch. And what I'd done is I built a collage, and I had actually used machine stitching and hand stitching on this to stitch this down. I had put this bird on early on in the process, and I had everything stitched down, and then I was adding all my hand stitch, and it was later in the process when I decided to add the silhouette of this bigger bird. And this one I really like, and I feel like it's really successful. I think because there actually isn't a huge contrast in terms of what's outside of the bird and inside of the bird. There is some black out here. What this did, I think, adding this was just giving another level of interest. So there's close-up things to look at and there's far away things to look at. This piece is about 10 inches square, so it's quite a bit bigger than this piece, quite a bit bigger than the one I'm working on today. So you do, in some ways, have more options about what to do. But in evaluating this piece, I am seeing that there isn't a huge contrast, and really this bigger silhouette of the bird is fairly well integrated, and because it's such a dark line, it shows up on its own. This one, I really have taken the time to change what's inside the bird as opposed to what's outside the bird. The other thing I'm noticing is that the colors in this are very contrasting and bold, whereas the colors in this are fairly unified. I mean, there is orange and there is blue and yellow and, you know, there's different shades, but because of this text fabric that's behind it, in large portions of it, there is sort of a unity to this piece in terms of contrast that doesn't exist here. So I don't think that I can really compare this one to this one in terms of decision making. This one is closer, but even this one seems to me, when I look at it, that there's sort of a unifying color in the background of this sort of orangey, yellow, golden color. So I think that was worthwhile for me to look at and think about. And I have to just let it sink in, I think, and then decide where to go. And if I can't come to a decision at this point, that's fine. I'll just continue stitching and working. And I think at some point it's going to occur to me, I'm going to know exactly what to do in terms of how to approach the inside and the outside of this bird. Another option that I have is to use a sheer fabric. So I have cheesecloth. These are two. This is tea dyed and this is coffee dyed. And then I also have, I think this was from a curtain, and it's also tea dyed. So neither of these are white, but you know, an option is to have the shape, the inside part. That's an option too, and it might be nice. In terms of color, I feel like this is kind of nice with it. What I could do is cut out the shape of this and lay it down and look at it and see what I think. It's a little hard to tell unless I get the shape. So what I could do is take the template that I used to trace this. It's actually kind of hard to use a marking pen like this on this kind of cheesecloth fabric. So what I'm going to do is just lay it on top and cut around it. So that's an option. I'm not entirely sure how I feel about it. It's not an immediate yes, but I have this piece cut out and ready. So I'm just going to put it aside and continue stitching. The other thing that I am noticing right now is that this is kind of wonky in terms of being square, and that doesn't bother me. I notice it. I feel like that's going to change as I stitch. And if I turn it over, yeah, the exact points where I felt like it was wonky is true. There's some yellow up here. This actually is even. There's some extra fabric on the bottom here, which I think I like. So it's mainly this piece here. It's not a huge deal. There's some over here too. Things are going to pull in as I stitch, but it also wouldn't be a big deal to come in and snip this a little bit at this stage. That's a little bit better from the back. From the front, what it makes me want to do is snip a little bit off the top of this. So those were not super necessary things, but things that along the way might be good to do, especially if it's distracting. It's something that's good to do. I also noticed that this piece of yellow doesn't go all the way to the edge like the green does. It's a little bit shorter, and the stitching I've done pulls it in. So these are all things that I can acknowledge are happening, but they don't bother me a lot, and I know that those things will change as I stitch. And I also am aware, because of the way I work, that I may be adding more pieces of fabric and collage as I work. And so it is really a work in progress, and unless it's something that's very, very distracting and I know I don't like and it's easy to deal with, like the cutting off of this piece, then I try to not get too worried about it and just continue with this stitching, which is enjoyable and relaxing and an equally important part of the process. Now I'm coming in with this topaz color, which is a fairly good match. Not so much for this one, but for these two colors here. And I'm going to do some stitching with 2 strands of this color. So I'm starting over on the one side of the bird, coming in with some straight stitches and deciding pretty quickly that I want to make them little crosses or plus signs. And I'm just moving along in an intuitive way. I don't want them to be evenly spaced or even exactly the same size. So I'm just starting to build this mark making of crosses and crosses and crosses. And so it becomes a pattern, it becomes color, and there's some continuity that starts to be created. These stitches are going over the different patches of fabric, they're going over different colors, and because the stitching is all in the same color, it's starting to unify. And it's not a particularly bold color that I'm using. It's not a black or a white or a very, very dark toned color. And so it's sort of a subtle unity that's happening. And now that I've moved to the other side of the bird, I've decided that I want to add the same type of marks that I've added on the other side, again for unity, and just do these little crosses in this upper area. So what I'll end up with is both sort of corners, the bottom left and the top right corner, are going to have these same marks. And in a way, it's going to appear like that, like the bird is in front of this pattern. And so it will make the bird pop out a bit and the background recede a little bit. And it just adds another dimension of interest to this part of the bird. It's still very early stages, but the framework is starting to be laid down for a really nice stitched piece. So I've added some stitches in these 2 corner areas in the topaz color. And now I'm thinking about doing some stitching inside the bird. And I thought what I would try is adding some white and see if that's going to add the kind of contrast that I'm looking for. I think what I'm going to do is a blanket stitch, and I'm going to start about here and move downwards with the blanket stitch. And so to keep me on track, I think I'm going to bring in this marking pen again and just draw some lines and use them as a guide. I may deviate from that, but it gives me somewhere to start. So I've added blanket stitch here in 2 directions. I'm not sure at this point how I feel about it, whether I like it or not. I'm just going to continue stitching. And I think the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little eye for this bird. And I also want to darken this line. So I've drawn myself an eye with my marking pen. Just made a nice big circular shape because I want him to have a big eye. And I'm starting with white. I'm outlining just the very edges of the circle that I've drawn in white. And then I'm going to switch to black, and I'm going to come in and fill in the center part of the eye with black. And now I've decided that I want the line, the outline of the bird to be more bold and thicker. And so I'm going back to the initial lines that I've made, and I'm just filling them in. And I'm making it thicker and darker because I've decided that I really want the outline part of the bird to be featured. Now that I've outlined the bird in a heavier stitch and added an eye, I'm going to come back in with white, and I'm going to do some stitching on these patches here that don't have anything yet on them holding them down except the basting stitches. And then I want to remove my basting stitches. I don't always remove my basting stitches. In this case, I think that I want to take them out, and they're a little distracting to me. So I decide to do a blanket stitch in white, just like I had done in the beginning stitches on the bird. I'm thinking that this might give me an idea about how to move forward with the stitching on the bird. And since the only thing I've done so far is this stitching in white, it seemed like a logical choice to stitch around on this turquoise and this orange. And now that they're all secured down, it's a great time to hop to the back and remove the basting stitches that I'm finding distracting, and just pull them out and continue on and see where the next idea comes from. So I'm continuing with white stitches. I've added a row in between the patches on the bird I just worked on and the initial row of blanket stitch. And I'm going to surround all of the other orange patches that I have with this white blanket stitch. Just another way to tie everything together and have this same stitch and color in more than one spot on the piece. And I go even further than that, and I also add them to the other patches as well. So it's on the blue and the orange, all of the other pieces that are outside of the bird. And now I'm moving back to the bird, and I've decided to continue with the blanket stitch and move around the bird's eye and continue to spiral out from there with this same blanket stitch, making these white lines that just spiral and continue inside of the bird. As I continue working my way down the bird with this blanket stitch, I'm noticing how much the stitches are looking almost like feathers. They're connected. It's a continuous look. It's making me think almost of a dove. And so I'm liking the way that it's working. After adding several rows of this continuous spiraling blanket stitch, I really like the way it's looking. So I'm going to continue and fill the rest of the bird in with that. So I filled in the bird with the rest of the blanket stitch, And I added a little bit more in the topaz that wasn't here before, so it's unified this one patch. And I added the same stitches that are in this other patch here. So I think she's looking really nice. I'm grabbing that fuchsia color that's similar to the pink that's on the bird, but it's got a little bit more purple in it. And I'm going to add some stitching around the edge of this orange patch and continue on into this pink fuchsia piece of fabric and just move my way around it on the outside of the bird. Then I decide that I want this color to be in another spot, so I'm moving up to the top and I'm adding the same color in the straight stitches that are similar to the dark turquoise ones that are below it. So it's these uneven lines that are spaced apart where I move back and forth and fill in the spaces that I've made before. And I think that this is adding texture and color, and it's tying everything together because there really only is that one wide strip of the pink in the middle of the piece, and there isn't any other pink. So I'm feeling like this is adding quite a bit to the piece and it's unifying it. So I decide that I'm going to add stitches on the edge of this turquoise patch as well as to the patch itself. Just more of these straight stitches that are uneven in length and they're not completely straight in their angle. So as I add more stitches to this light turquoise patch and the stitches start to move down towards the bird and towards that large piece of the dark pink, I'm feeling like this is really tying everything together, pulling it together and really unifying. So I decide to stitch all the way down to the pink patch of fabric and to stitch right into it so that it becomes one piece. Switching to the dark turquoise floss, my tactic is the same here. Add more stitching between the turquoise patch and the turquoise stitches that already exist and try to unify those two areas. And now thinking about the black outline of the bird, I decide that I want to have some black along the edges. So I add some blanket stitch to part of the edge on the one side, and then I hop to the other side and I decide to add blanket stitch in black all the way around where the bottom of the bird is. So from the top of his back all the way over to his belly, there'll be some black right along the edges that'll kind of contain the bird in a way. I also decide that I want to have another spot to have black, so I add a little bit of black right at the top. I've added a little piece of green fabric along the top here because this yellow piece wasn't quite reaching the edge, and with everything pulling in, it was starting to become a little bit wonky. So I added a patch of this same green fabric and some heavy stitching. And I continued my green stitching along the top, and then I added some green stitching around this little turquoise patch. A few green stitches down here, and this is where we're at. So I think at this point, there's just a little bit more stitching I want to do on the outside of the bird, and I'm going to be thinking more about what I want to do for a border. I think what it needs now is more of this same fuchsia color that I've put up here. I'm just going to integrate it a little bit more on the outside of the bird and see how that looks. So I'm starting where I already had some fuchsia stitches and just moving up in the top area of the piece where there weren't the fuchsia stitches before, and I'm kind of connecting the two areas that had the stitches. Then I move up into the area with the darker turquoise and I start adding stitches in there, and I'm feeling like that's really adding, and there's a tiny little patch that it doesn't have any blanket stitch on the edge, and so I think this is a good spot to add some blanket stitch in this fuchsia color. It can be alongside the green and the black on either side of it. And then move back after I finish the blanket stitch and continue adding stitches all across the top where there isn't stitches, connecting all the areas and just kind of unifying the piece. So I've added this fuchsia everywhere around the bird. Just lots of straight stitching, and I like the way that it's unified everything. So now I'm thinking about the border, and one idea I have is to just couch some yarn in black around the piece. I think that that's going to look nice. I was also thinking about white too, adding some more white at the edge, but I might do that on top of the black. But what I think I'll do now is I'll couch this black on, and then I'll think about, I could even add more couching or more things if I think it needs more. But at this point, I'll put the black on and see how I feel about that. So I've taken some clips and just attached the yarn around the piece before I stitch it. It's not really necessary because it's done quite loosely. But what it does is it helps keep the yarn out of my way when I'm stitching. When I don't put clips on, sometimes what can happen is as I'm stitching and the thread that I'm using moves around, it can grab a hold of the yarn and the yarn starts getting tangled with it, or something pulls on the yarn, and this is just a way to kind of loosely hold it in place as I stitch around. So I've couched on this black. I'm going to bring in a piece of white paper, make it a little easier to see. It's given me an idea about adding more black into the piece, just for some accents and just to really make the bird part of it pop. The first embellishment that I do is to the pink area, where I come in with this white gel pen and I just make some marks inside each little box. And with the same idea of boxes, I'm going to come in with that lightest turquoise color and make little X's or crosses inside each little white stitched box that's been formed from the blanket stitch that I've done. So I'm going to cover this whole lower area with these little cross marks. And I'm moving up to the head, and I'm doing the same thing on the beak and all around the eye. So even in the tiny little boxes that are formed in the beak, I'm making the tiniest of little X's. I'm using 2 strands of embroidery floss, which is what I've done throughout. Then I'm coming in and I've decided to do French knots. And so I start at the very top of what I'm thinking as the wing. And then I'm going to move outside of the bird and add some of the black marks that I was thinking about making. These are just going to be uneven lines. Some are going to be vertical and some are going to be horizontal. I'm just moving around the piece and adding them, sort of an intuitive way, deciding where to put them, where it seems like a mark would help. And looking at the bird, I decide that I want more French knots, but I don't want to have it completely filled with these larger French knots. So I complete the wing shape, the outside, with 2 rows of French knots. And then I come back on the inside with smaller French knots where I'm only wrapping the yarn twice to fill in with just the tiniest of tiny dots. So here's our little dove. I've decided that she's a dove. And I've added these smaller French knots. So sort of continue this really large wing that's added some more interest. And now I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, is it done? I'm not sure. I feel like it might be done, but I need to give it a minute. Maybe walk away, look at something else and come back fresh. That's a really helpful way to know if something's done. The other thing I can do, because my background is black, is to bring in my piece of paper again and look at this on a white background and see what I think. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on my iron, and I'm going to iron it from the back. I'm going to flip it over, and I'm going to just press on it with the heat and just give it a tiny bit of heat and pressing to flatten it and stretch it out. Then I'll take my photograph and have a look at it and see what I'm thinking about whether or not this little dove is finished. So I've decided that it does need more, and what it needs is white. So I'm just moving around and adding some marks of white. There's already a little bit of white in this area. I'm just enhancing it, making it show up a bit more. So I'm going to do that in a few spots. And I'm also going to add some white maybe in some other spots where there isn't already white. Now, there wasn't really white down here. I added some here. I'm working on this. I may enhance the white that's here and, you know, a couple other places. And I'm thinking that that might be the last thing that this piece needs before it's finished. So here's my white marks. Put it in front of white paper so you can see it even clearer. Oh, I think she looks good. She looks sweet. I think that she's done. I'm going to put up some pictures so you can see it a little bit closer. She's done. If you've been watching from the beginning, you'll remember that a lot of thought went into the making of this piece. First, I looked at some previous pieces that I'd done, and that helped me to think about what I wanted to do with this piece. Now, remember this cutout I'd made? I thought maybe a sheer fabric would work. But in the end, I didn't use it. I also thought about maybe adding more than just black to this border. But in the end, this border worked, and it didn't need anything else. Have a look at this sweet dove. This was a really fun project and a really interesting challenge. Thank you so much for joining me. Bye.